But yeah, welcome everyone to ArChi-TECH Network number 26. What's all the hype about Hypar with Andrew Heuman? So thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today and
Yeah, thanks for
giving us a
having
bit of
me.
your time on your lazy Sunday.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
But yeah, we're super interested to have a chat with you. Actually, a load of people reached out and we're really excited about this talk. So
Oh, great.
I'm sure the name of Hyper and yourself has spread wide already. So yeah, thank you so much for joining. I see we've got Guillaume and Faisal in the room as usual. And Guillaume is in Arizona. Faisal is in Dubai, I think, still. And Andrew is here in New York with
Yeah.
probably not too far from myself. Um, so yeah, I think maybe to give everyone an introduction to the crowd, an introduction to yourself, Andrew, and to introduce you. So, for those who don't know, Andrew is an American architect. He is currently a software developer at Hypar. But you've kind of gone through a pretty interesting career and evolution from architecture to startup to the tech world. So you spent some time at like NBBJ Woods
Hmm.
Bagot as like a computational specialist. Then you went through the WeWork era, the famous WeWork era,
Indeed.
and now you are at Hyper. And you've also taught a little bit at Columbia, or are you still
Yeah.
teaching at Columbia?
Not currently. Yeah, there
Mm,
were a couple summers in a row I had done a course, but I'm not doing that this year.
yeah. What were you teaching? Was it like computation or?
It's ADR2, which is Columbia's Advanced Drawing and Representation course, and it's sort of an interesting course that has a sort of expansive notion of what drawing is. So I was obviously focusing a lot on like how programming and scripting are sort of can be thought of as forms of drawing and representation.
Nice. And I missed out a up and coming artist as well with your drawings, which we will touch on at some point. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything you add to the introduction. Um, Otherwise, I thought before we get into the world of Hyper, it would be interesting to talk about your backgrounds and like how you
Yeah,
got to Hyper and how you've transitioned to become a software developer now.
yeah, for sure.
Which is kind of it was an interesting build up to have you because we had your buddy Brian for our 20th talk talking about robotics and what he's doing now. Obviously, you guys were at Woods Bagot and we worked together. And then we also had Randy Deutsch a couple weekends ago now to talk about super users, and you were kind of the featured super user in the book. So I feel like we're on a super user kind of string at the moment. But yeah, it'd be interesting. Like, how did you get that? Like, talk us through the evolution from architecture practice. Did you feel kind of frustrated with conventional practice? Do you kind of miss traditional architecture practice, or did you always see yourself heading over to the software tech side and that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, so when I graduated from college, I sort of had it in my head that it was really important to me to not just be the technician, not just be the like scripting person. Because by that
Yeah,
time, I had already kind of started getting into Grasshopper. I was really into it. I thought it was super cool. And it did help me get my first job. But my first role was definitely more of a traditional, like a designer on a team,
right.
working on actual projects, but obviously deploying scripting tools like Grasshopper and other sort of custom plugin development to help us deliver those projects. And over time at NBBJ, I moved more and more into kind of like a firm-wide resource sort of a role
Yeah,
and sort of improved my own sort of coding capabilities along the way. And I think there was a fork in the road at some point where I kind of had to make a decision like, and I don't know exactly when this happened, sometime in my sort of first couple years at NBBJ where it's like, okay, are you gonna get licensed? Are you gonna be an architect who just happens to also do this other thing, or are you really gonna double down on specializing? And somehow wound up in the second pathway. I think I'm really glad I did. It wasn't even a super conscious decision, although I do remember a meeting where the sort of principals of the studio were saying, "So when are you going to get your license?" And I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna. I kind of think I'm gonna go this tech route, and it's just sort of with every successive job, I've been doing more and more coding up to the point where now it's the bread and butter of what I do every day at Hypar. and I still really love design, and I still, relate a lot to the sort of processes of being an architect on the ground. But I also was sort of, I always found that I could have a greater impact by writing code for other designers to work with, for building design tools for other people, than just trying to design for myself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting move. And actually, one line that I have written down here that I missed out of your intro is that you are also the creator of the Human Grasshopper plugin and Human AI, and so you've been in that kind of space between architect and software developer for a little bit. When did you actually start Human? To when
So
was that process?
yeah, that was my first ever Grasshopper plugin, and it started as a series of like janky C# scripts that I wrote for my fifth year architecture thesis. I was just like needing to grab a bunch of information off of Rhino layers, and so I copied somebody's script from the forum and started changing it and building on it and adding new functionality, and was like, oh, this might actually be useful to some people, and so at a certain point decided to actually release it as a plugin, and it just sort of evolved from there.
Yeah, I was just looking at Food for Rhino. It's like 2018, I feel. This is the oldest one you can download now. But yeah, it's a good. I mean, to even develop your own app is a full-time thing to keep it going, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't spend so much time on maintaining those plugins anymore, but
It's
it
just out
certainly
there.
could take up more of my time
Yeah,
if I let it.
yeah. I always wonder, like, how do you keep all these things going? So then you kind of
Well, I
transition.
don't for all of them.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
you kind of transitioned from, um, let's say, working directly for an architecture practice, like your last practice was Woods Bagot, right? And that's when you went over to WeWork, and you kind of stepped over to that, startup world. Or although I don't know if WeWork can still be classed as a startup, like it's a pretty
Well, yeah.
established company right now.
Yeah, but they like to think of themselves as a
Yeah,
startup.
the
There
startup
was certainly
feel.
some of that mentality. Yeah.
Well, so
Yeah,
yeah,
it was oh, sorry, go ahead.
yeah. How do you see? And now you're obviously working for a startup now. Um, how do you feel that's tying into like the whole architecture scene right now? Because it does seem like architecture practice, just the business model, and it's just doesn't quite seem to be working. Like it needs to be disrupted. But at the same time, you're seeing a couple years ago when I saw that you guys and Brian went over to WeWork. Like WeWork were just hoovering up so many people, and it seemed like there was this transition from practice to the tech world. And it wasn't only WeWork, right? There's people going to like Google and all these other kind of stuff, Katera and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
How do you feel that's playing? Like, do you see more and more architects going over to the tech world, and how, is practices are going to have to evolve slightly to keep talent in there? Do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think so. I think there are a number of sort of factors at play. I mean, one is that these companies that, like WeWork and Katera, regardless of how things ultimately wound up, I think there was a smart thing happening, which was to sort of unite technology with a new business model,
Yeah,
to unite the ability to sort of, be your own client and vertically integrate all of the design all the way through to the delivery of these, spatial products with a technology stack that supports like much more streamlined design and delivery, and really integrates all of those things together. Because I think one of the barriers to the kind of evolution of tech in our industry is the sort of silos between disciplines and
right.
the sort of contractual relationships and all this stuff. And so new business models and new tech really go hand in hand. And I think that just because WeWork, I mean, in some sense failed, or at least sort of changed gears, to me is not a doesn't isn't a condemnation of that general idea. I
Right.
think we're seeing now, and actually a lot of these new startups have a lot of WeWork alums in them.
Yeah.
Companies like Fed Negro's Kanoa and others that are doing really interesting stuff that still think about a new business model paired with really compelling technology. And I think that is really attractive to designers who have some of these capabilities, And that's partly because, a tech company is probably going to pay a little better than an architecture firm. But I think maybe more importantly, very few firms in the traditional sense have figured out how to create a career path for tech experts and specialists. It's like if you are a young computational designer at a firm, it's hard to see how you evolve. You're probably not going to follow the standard track where, you become an associate and then you become a principal. All firms have different terms for these things. But, I think a lot of firms are not putting their technological staff along a sort of clear trajectory for growth, and so they start looking elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean that's funny you say. That's exactly what we touched on with Randy when we were saying I feel like we're kind of in the era of specialists, right?
Yeah.
There's a computational specialist, a BIM specialist. Like even Guillaume transitioned from a designer at Big to a computational specialist at Big. Whilst I was there, and I transitioned from BIM to a design technology specialist, and they kind of asked me, they were like, oh, we don't actually know exactly what to call you. So like, I had to go and have a think about it, and like, do you want to be a computational BIM specialist? Or I was like, this is getting a bit confusing.
Yeah. Oh,
So
yeah.
that's why I transitioned as a design technology specialist to, it's a bit more of a broader term and you could do things. But yeah, I think you're right. It's kind of, I mean, that's a pro and con, right? I think
Yeah.
you don't have that established career path, but if you're at the right place, you can potentially craft your own in a way and take it uh, in different places. But yeah, it's just an interesting era. I feel like we're in this specialist era for the architecture firms, but then there's all these new opportunities to go and work for Google or WeWork and stuff like that, which I felt like
Yeah.
a couple of years ago wasn't even so much of a thought, was it? Or
Yeah.
maybe more than a couple of years ago, but so yeah. So then you went to WeWork. I remember when I came to WeWork for one of those AIA like design technology meetups, and everyone was
Oh, yeah,
super
yeah.
curious, like, what have these guys been doing? Because everyone was like, what are they getting into? And you presented, I think it was you uh,
And
and
Jonathan, right? Jonathan Schumacher?
yeah,
Or was, yeah.
Jonathan Schumacher, that was it. And you guys presented what you're working on. It was super interesting, like this crazy growth chart of WeWork. And I remember you specifically were kind of dealing with a lot of the like automated fit outs and that kind of stuff. Um, so yeah, and then obviously the WeWork era took a turn, and then you went over to Hypar, was it, or how maybe fill in how that transition came about?
Yeah, I mean, things had already started looking a little weird at WeWork. I wasn't really sure how things were going to shake out. I had already seen a lot of my friends either quit or get let go, and it just felt like even I probably could have stayed on a while longer, but it just didn't feel like it was going to be fun for a lot longer. And maybe priorities would reorient in a way that the things that I was working on might not be so important. And I was lucky enough to get a call from Ian, who I think is actually listening today. Hi, Ian.
Cool.
And he
You can come up later
said,
and join in if you want.
"Yeah, yeah, we might put you on the spot."
So we also got your buddy Brian in the audience as well. So
Yeah,
we'll have to get him up in a
I'm
minute.
I'm honored to have so many friends in the audience. But yeah, so Ian called me up and said, hey, how are things going at WeWork? And we're starting this new thing. And I was already a little bit familiar with Hypar because we had actually talked to the Hypar team pretty early on to see if some of the tech would support what we were trying to do with automation. And so, I kind of had a sense of what they were building, and I was pretty excited about it. And so when Ian reached out, I jumped at the opportunity. He showed me a few demos, and, I'll never forget, we were sitting in a coffee shop just down the street from WeWork HQ, and he pulled out an iPad and just, quickly composed this, super parametric model of a building where, you could just, without any wires, without any, visual programming. You just sort of compose different systems together, a tower, a facade, a core, a structure, and then manipulate any of those parameters, all right there in front of me on this iPad. And my jaw kind of dropped. I was really impressed by how far they had come. And it introduced something that we've been working on ever since, too, which is this idea that, like, in addition to having things that are automatically generated, you can also interact with them through drawing or direct manipulation. So he showed me that you could just, with your fingertip, sketch a little polyline or whatever, and that would be, the basis for the massing. And to me, it seemed like what the future of this sort of whole environment around computational modeling and automation needed to look like. So I was pretty thrilled to get the opportunity.
Yeah, no, I mean that's what we'll jump into this because it's like, that's the thing I've been kind of waiting. Like, is someone not, working on some like the red pillar or like the next thing? Because it just seems like we're at that point where it's like we can do a lot better than the tools that we have.
Yeah.
So yeah, you joined Hypar as a software developer. Just before we get on to the pure topic of Hypar, so now you are a software developer, right? You're as a software developer. At any point, did you take? Is this all self-taught, or did you take any kind of, one of those evening courses or like full stack developer courses that they have? Or
Yeah. In college, I took one like intro to CS summer course, and then I took one more semester in the engineering school. So
oh
I think
wow,
I
so
have
you really
I have
picked
a
it up at university essentially.
2 semesters of CS under my belt, which was, enough to get the basics. But I would say the vast majority of what I've picked up has been self-taught. And, a huge aspect of that, a lot of, I really got started with Grasshopper plugins, and a big way that I did that was just like looking at what other people had written and trying to kind of like reverse engineer existing components and stuff like that. And so Grasshopper was sort of my first programming language. But I was sort of learning along the way how to fill in the gaps what Grasshopper alone couldn't provide by, starting to script in C sharp. And I've always been the type to like, play around with a tutorial on the weekend or whatever. So, I've dabbled in all kinds of things, and I'm not particularly good at a great number of them, but it was enough of these skills, and then finally getting to put them to work at WeWork, where it was a broader stack. I wasn't just doing Grasshopper stuff anymore. Got an opportunity to work with amazing people who could kind of actually review my code and teach me a lot as I was going. And I would say too, like, I got hired as a, sorry if you can hear all those sirens.
It's all right. I'll
We'll
probably
let that
hear it up.
pass.
I'm on the Upper East Side. Where
Yeah,
you're down
they're
on the Lower East Side, or is it?
Lower East Side. Yeah,
You
they're
might
coming
hear
to
it
you
in a minute if
next.
they're coming this way.
Yeah. But, so I did get hired as a software developer at Hypar, but a big part of what attracted me to the job was that, I was going to get to work with people who could teach me, and that there wasn't an expectation that I should already be, like a polished engineer who came out of some, software engineering program. There was an expectation that, the value I brought was primarily like, disciplinary knowledge, domain knowledge, and then I could also write some code, but they were, Matt, our CTO, had confidence that he could sort of teach me and shape me into the engineer that I needed to be. And it's been really great to work in an environment that can sort of foster that.
Yeah, that's the best way to learn. I mean, I remember. I mean, the reason I asked you is to kind of give some of the young architects in the audience a kind of idea of whether they should pursue that kind of. I think the great thing about American universities is you can do. It's not like a pure. You can jump into other classes and stuff. In the UK,
Yeah.
it's not so much like you study architecture and you do all the architecture modules. But I mean, I've thought myself at one point of whether to do. I still would actually kind of like to get into that real coding side. At one point, I was going to do a master's in computation or something to make that transition. But I was similar to you. I was lucky to join Front, and they just got that Zaha product. So yeah, I think for any young architects in the crowd, you don't have to go and specialize in some kind of course, but maybe it's something. I know, was it Jonathan Schumacher did do one of those full stack courses, but
I think he did, yeah.
would you recommend it for a young architect?
I mean, I think everybody learns a little differently. To me, the number one thing, regardless of whether you want to take a formal course or you want to kind of steer your own way, the most important thing is to have like projects to work on. And I think like you learn so much more actually trying to build a thing, solve a real problem. I've been lucky enough that in my career I've gotten to do that on the clock, do that as like part of my job. But even outside of that, a lot of the plugins and things were done on the weekends or on vacation or on off time. And I think like having a project that you can get excited about, that you want to spend some of your own time on, you learn so much more trying to solve the real problems that you encounter and learning what worked and didn't work than you'll ever learn just like, following somebody else's instructions to produce a project. So I think there's really no substitute for like just trying to build a thing.
Yeah, that's so true.
And,
That's so true.
in whatever language you want to learn.
Yeah, yeah. I'm in the starting an Unreal life right now and getting into the Unreal game engine and stuff. And you're so right. It's like,
Oh, nice.
you can pick up so much by going to tutorials and courses and stuff, but you just gotta build something here.
Yeah, and it's the stuff that you sort of figure out for yourself that sticks
Yeah,
ultimately. Like I've done a bunch, I took Angular tutorials for a couple weeks, and I don't remember anything about Angular because I never got to the point where I was actually trying to build anything with it.
right, right, right. Interesting. All right, so to jump onto the topic of Hyper, do you want to give those in the audience that may not be familiar with Hyper already a little bit of a kind of elevator pitch of what Hyper is?
Sure.
Or I know it was. If Ian's in the crowd and he wants to come up as well, come up, raise your hand. We'll bring him up on the stage. But if not, yeah, maybe just give us a little bit of an intro to Hyper.
Yeah, I mean, Ian, feel free to jump in if you'd like to. I'll do my best. So Hypar is a new cloud-based, web-based design platform for the AEC industry. So for architects, engineers, and construction. And it's built from the ground up with the sort of idea of sort of parametric modeling and automation as being sort of the core of a design process. So it is a design environment. You can kind of get in and model in 3D and mass stuff up. But one of the core ideas is that it's open and extensible. So anyone can add new functionality to the Hypar platform by writing what we refer to as functions. So a function is basically a little piece of code or a script that is responsible for defining the logic of some building system. So you might have an idea for a building massing, and you can, use one of our existing functions for massing to kind of sketch it out, or you could write some code that generates that massing with some parameters and use that as well. So Hypar is a sort of design environment that makes it very easy to hook together these various systems in an intelligent way. And so you can build up a sort of fairly custom and fine-tuned design environment to solve the design problems that matter to you, that work for you. So some of your functions might be doing various kinds of analysis. Others might just be doing like, aesthetic studies, facade patterning or things like that. And all of these things are shareable. So you can share your workflows with other people. You can also share individual functions or systems that you author. And so it becomes this kind of community ecosystem of architectural knowledge and expertise.
Yeah, I think there's so many really interesting points that you guys kind of combines, like the idea of stitching it all, sharing scripts, and like I remember you've come in and showed us Hyper a couple times, and like first time it was just wow, there's all these things going on, and then the second time it seems like you kind of focused in on a particular kind of area of architecture, which we'll swing back to. But, I guess it was a kind of like I said, we are in this era of softwares like Rhino, Revit, and this every firm seems to kind of dance between our design world and our documentation world, and it's definitely not a very efficient process, right? So I feel
Yeah.
Hyper was kind of it's like the first in this new generation of streamlining that process, uh, putting it into the cloud and tapping into almost like that video game style feel to it. Although I wouldn't say it's like it's not like a first person shoot style, but we've had a good few talks where I really see game engines playing a huge role in the future of like the tools that we use, I think Hypar is a great example of where it's moving, where that part of the industry is moving. Although I don't think Hypar is based on Unity Unreal, or
No.
no, it's all kind of built from scratch.
Yeah, although I mean, I think a lot of that, like we rely on 3JS, which is an open source 3D library for the web. That I think a lot of its applications have been put towards games, and I think there's just been a lot of really interesting advancement in the technology in general that gets especially around computer graphics that makes its way back to AC and that we rely on.
Yeah. So to describe it from my perspective as a initial user, I thought it was really exciting. So, for me, I felt like Hyper just put a lot of tools into one basket, and you can now go online, you can Google Map your site, you can quickly draw a building outline, or a footprint. Then you can tap into a massing scripts that maybe Andrew has made or Guillaume has made and put onto this library, and very quickly turn that mass into a building. And I could tap into, like, maybe Andrew made a massing scripts, Guillaume made a really cool facade script, and Faisal made this incredible, like, layout script, and I can tap into all of those, and within a few minutes I've got a pretty decent decent building that I can kind of either use for initial kind of, I guess, what would be feasibility studies, or I can actually use, and you can, it's all kind of talks with the tools that we do have, like with Grass. So you can upload your script as a Grasshopper script, right? And it goes into, like,
Yep.
the online library and that kind of stuff. So when you guys first set out, did you guys? Because I remember when you first presented it, I felt like, man, this could be used by the developers at the early stage. I could see this being used by architects. I could see this being used by potentially contractors. Like, did you have an initial kind of user in mind, or at the beginning, or is kind of more open ended? Let's just streamline this design to build process, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've gone back and forth over time about who's the kind of most obvious set of users to go after first. I think we've set our sights on a pretty broad swath of potential use cases. And one of our co-founders, Anthony, often says that Hypar is just a tool for anyone who needs to make a $50,000 or more decision about a building. We really conceive of ourselves as sort of like a platform for decision making. With that said, I think the groups that have really started to gravitate to Hypar, the sort of disciplines, we certainly have a lot of architects, but especially like design build architects, where there is some vertical integration and where they really do want to know about the downstream construction consequences for design decisions made at the beginning. We also work with like building product manufacturers who are interested to spec out their systems and like see a system totally deployed across an entire building. Typically, that work is a loss leader for them, and so they would rather just have it be automated. And we've also talked with developers, like real estate developers and other kinds of customers, as well as I think some of these kind of up and coming startups as well, which like we were talking about before, are partnering an interesting new business model that involves design and construction with some sort of aspects of automatable design process. So we find that companies that are already starting to think that way are already thinking about some sort of spatial product that they have to deploy repeatedly with some variables but a lot of consistency. Hypar is a really great platform for those kinds of design problems.
Yeah, I think that was what was really interesting to see. Like, between the first time we talked to you guys about Hyper and the second time, it seemed like you guys had honed in a little bit towards that almost like prefab modular building kind of building system, uh, side of things, which I think is, not only is Hyper like a new part of a new generation of how we design and build stuff, but then you're also linking into this new generation of how we actually build, rather than kind of in situ, pouring liquid into something and, and waiting for it to dry. This new prefabricated modular building systems, which I think is super exciting. Obviously, we in the office have just kind of released a little preview of our own kind of building system called Neighbor, which is maybe again a little bit of a glimpse into how the architecture industry is transitioning into the startup world. But that was really interesting that you guys came about that. And so, was that just kind of came about, or was that something you guys kind of foreseen? Because it's it obviously ties in really well.
I mean, there are anytime you're doing something in a modular way, or even if you're just producing a sort of a common spatial product over and over and over again. I like my experience at WeWork. We were deploying WeWorks in buildings of various shapes and sizes and contexts, but we were basically always trying to produce a WeWork. And so opportunities like that are sort of a natural fit. I do think that I'm losing my train of thought a little bit, but I think one of the important things about our approach from the beginning is that we actually get to be a little bit agnostic about how the design process is done or how the industry is going to evolve, because from the get-go we're an extensible open platform where anyone can add new logic and systems. And so that means that we don't have to build specifically a set of functionality for modular. We can just make sure that our basic developer tools support building something around modular. And so adding functionality for modular construction doesn't necessarily mean that we have to rewrite the core platform. All we have to do is publish new systems, publish new functions, basically, that are sort of responsible for these kinds of design strategies. So any kind of novel design strategy. I don't think we're going to be 3D printing buildings anytime soon. But if you wanted to, and you wanted to write a function for that sort of thing on Hypar, you absolutely could. So we get to, by virtue of being extensible, we get to be really flexible and sort of adapt to whatever is happening in the industry at any given moment.
That's super interesting. So basically, you guys kind of you guys came up with the system, and actually, it was just kind of who it was adopted by first happened to be kind of more prefab modular kind of side of things, which is super interesting to see. I think I think we will see more and more kind of these dedicated startups for like a specific type of typology that ties into this building system, and I can see Hypar being a huge part of that side of things becoming a success.
Yeah, I mean, we already see, I think, a lot of these hyper specialized, one typology automation tools
Yeah,
springing up all over, various kinds of building configurators and stuff. And the thing that's hard about that is that every company that wants to do that has to start from square one, has to build this entire system. They've got to figure out, cloud deployment, and they've got to figure out identity and security, and they've got to figure out interoperability with other platforms. And so our big hope is that Hypar becomes the base layer for a wide array of these sort of future and nascent startups who want to take advantage of smart automation, parametric modeling, scalability on the cloud, but don't want to have to build all of those individual components themselves. They just want to focus on the thing that makes them special, which is the actual logic of the building system that they're proposing.
yeah. I think I love the idea of that kind of having a platform where you could share your own scripts and that kind of thing. And also, I did find, and you have a bit of experience with this, is like when something is coming around the corner. Like right now, I think a lot of firms are playing around with VR kind of collaborative environments, right? And I know of like all these different firms build this in-house tool. And I remember like a few years ago that was like an in-house tool to move between Revit and Rhinos, the interoperability tool, and then eventually Flux comes about, and then another plugin comes about, and then eventually Rhino Inside came and kind of made that super um, accessible. But I see a lot of architecture firms getting into that software side of things, and I always see like they spend a lot of money developing some in-house plugin which works for them, but it's maybe not scalable enough for the market. And then they maybe deploy it on a project. And by the time that's done, some like, a Hypar comes out or a Rhino Inside comes out and just like, they've basically kind of done all that work to use it on one project. So do you think architects really should be building their own tools, or really it should be more like yourselves where you are architects building tools for everyone? I mean,
I mean, I think there has to be some of both. I think there, in order for tools to be sufficiently like reliable and cover a wide range of use cases, like you probably need to put some dedicated focus on that. At the same time, there are a lot of really amazing, generally useful tools. And the thing that I think has driven a lot of Hypar's thinking from early on is the recognition that these tools are being built over and over and over again by every different firm. Internally we call this the Stadium Bowl problem, because every firm that ever does any, sports work or whatever has a
the
has a
Stadium Bowl
Stadium
scripts.
Bowl generator in Grasshopper, and it's just crazy. There are probably 40 of these, floating around in various firms or available on the internet. And even the ones that have been made publicly available, even the ones that you can download, it's so much work to plug them into the thing that you're doing, because maybe they have a set of expectations about how your layers are structured, or maybe they require this plugin, or maybe they only work on this system or whatever. And so, a big part of Hypar's vision is that yes, we do want the community of AC technical experts who are building these useful tools to work on that and to make them available, but it should be effortless to then publish those things, share them, and then integrate them into other design projects. I think the other thing that's missing from the kind of pre-Hypar software landscape is a kind of common language that these various automation systems can speak. It's like, okay, I downloaded this script, but it produces all these things, and I need them to be some other thing in order to use them for the next part of the process. And so a big part of Hypar 2 is this common language of representation, which we call elements, which is sort of like an extensible representation for BIM entities, walls, floors, doors, columns, those sorts of things. And so being able to write all of your automation tools around this common language means that it's much easier to kind of hook them together to build something new.
Yeah, super. There's so many points that I really excited me about Hyper, and that's definitely one of them. So for everyone in the crowd who is new to Hyper, you can, whilst we're talking, you can go onto their website at hyper.io, and you can even download a free trial and give it a go whilst we're talking. Feel free to ask Andrew any questions on how to run it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I see we're also another point that is really interesting about Hyper is the team that you guys have. And I see we now have Ian on the stage. Hey, Ian, and thank you for joining us, who is the CEO and founder of Hyper. But you guys have this crazy, amazing team of like, you've got a whole bunch of people from the Autodesk era. You've got people that made Dynamo and from different like tech backgrounds. It seems like a really interesting uh, super users team to use Randy's terminology. But um, maybe Ian, if you want to jump in and say hello and talk about the team a little bit, it'd be really interesting.
I will. I apologize if the background noise gets to be a bit much. It's still early here on the West Coast, and my children are running around
No
screaming.
worries.
And I
We had
fully
someone.
didn't expect to talk.
Yeah, sorry to storm you in, but yeah, don't worry about that. But we thought we'd just say hello.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And I don't obviously want to steal any of Andrew's thunder, and I wish there was a way to lurk silently in here, because I could have like, now he presents in a different way, maybe because like I'm in the audience. I hope that's not the case. But he's done a fantastic job so far of summarizing what we're doing. And Andrew has been an enormous component of what we're. I mean, Andrew, like he gave such a nice like description of the demo that I showed him that wowed him and everything else. That is super overselling it. Like I think at the time, like Hypar probably barely did most of what he was saying. So we feel lucky every day that we were able to get Andrew to join the team. But on the topic of the team, Andrew is a perfect example of the kind of teammate that we love. the one thing that Andrew didn't talk about in terms of like upskilling, and you talked a little bit about like, should you take classes? Should architects learn how to code? Like all these questions that we get about like how does technology fit into the profession these days, and where do these super users kind of come from? Matt Campbell, who is a former Autodesk colleague of ours and our CTO, has played an enormous part in uh, uh, turning an Andrew Heuman into a what we call a proper software developer. Um, and Matt has this interesting strategy when he brings on people to the technical team of just looking at like their capacity. And Andrew is a perfect example of somebody who has an enormous capacity for learning the technologies that are required to do what we do. So if you're out there in the audience and you're thinking like, well, I just write Grasshopper scripts, or I'm just some computational, like I do some Dynamo stuff or whatever. And there's always this hesitancy that we sense um, in the industry to sort of put yourself forward as a software developer. Um, Recognize that like there are opportunities like Hypar where you can go and you can work with people like Matt, our CTO, who are fantastic at like providing you the opportunity and the runway to learn what you need to learn and putting you into situations where you can learn the skills that you need. So, I mean, Andrew is a proper full stack developer now. I mean, he does everything from writing functions for customer work on Hypar to doing front end development to doing 3D graphics. And it all comes back again to his capacity to take on those things. So, yeah, that the team is largely made of people that we've identified kind of like Andrew, individuals with a huge amount of capacity for learning with architectural or engineering backgrounds. We were lucky to take several of our team from WeWork, which was a great collector of architectural talent in the industry. And then putting them in situations where they basically have to succeed. We put Andrew on jobs and said like, well, this is a customer, they have a real problem, like in the real world, and let's build the tools on Hypar that help them succeed. So
Yeah.
I really want to give credit to Andrew for having gone on that whole journey, and also to Matt, our CTO, who's largely responsible for building that technical team.
Yeah, that's. I mean, that's what makes a good super user is this uh, thirst to learn and to adapt, and that is often, whilst it can be an initial shock, the best way to learn is to just get thrown in at the deep end, and you have to just work it out. But I think that's great for kind of maybe young architects in the crowd that are interested in getting into this space as a software developer. It's you don't necessarily have to go through that traditional or formal route to become it. And especially in the architecture world, like we said, we're in this weird era of kind of specialists and firms not quite knowing exactly what they're going to call specialists and things like that. So I think that's super interesting to hear. I will open it up to the audience. If anyone has a question for Andrew or Ian about Hypar, or just wants to kind of come in and join the conversation, put your hand up now and we'll open it up to the audience. Guillaume, I don't know if you want to chime in there.
Yeah, no, I'm sure, Ian, you're gonna have a bunch of applications in the coming days. You sold it pretty well. I'm curious actually, and you probably started answering it a little bit, Ian, but from Andrew's perspective, like Andrew, you were mentioning earlier that what's important to learn and to progress is to be in like kind of real life situation and trying to solve problems that are in front of you. And I do totally agree with that. That's how I learn as well. But I was wondering, how do you keep that motion going when you're working on kind of a more, I guess, generalist tool, helping other people to go through? Like, I guess Ian mentioned that you're trying to solve some problems directly for the client, but like, is that your day-to-day job, or how do you keep kind of this connection to the real world?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's incredibly important, and I keep learning this lesson more and more deeply as time goes on with Hypar. It's incredibly important to like maintain a connection with the people who are actually using your tools. So we do occasionally do sort of like contract engagements where we will help a firm get started using Hypar by building out some tools for them, working with them, and maybe even train them up in how to author functions on Hypar. And so that's a huge source of information about like real world problems and real users, because if somebody is paying us to build it, at least one person has this problem and needs a solution. And then we also do quite a lot of, just reaching out and talking to our users. We have a Discord community where people just kind of hang out and talk about the future of the profession and also about the product. And so that's a real resource for us where we can talk to users and say, hey, like, we're thinking about a feature like this. What do you think about this? Or, get feedback, get ideas for new functions and things like that. And nothing, there's no substitute as a developer for watching somebody try and use the tool that you conceived and built. It's incredibly educational to see somebody use and even struggle with the thing that you've put forward. It will always surprise you. The thing that you thought was super intuitive turns out not to be intuitive, or the thing that you thought was going to be incredibly complicated turns out to be really easy for people to figure out. It's just natural, and you'll just never know unless you spend that time with users directly. And so we're lucky enough to have a community that is excited about what we're doing and eager to test things out and try stuff. We've been setting up various pilot programs where we'll partner with a team at a firm and say, hey, why don't you try using some of these Hypar tools for your next project, and we'll be here to support you if you run into any trouble. And so all of these things are sources of information and knowledge about how to make stuff better for real users. And if you don't do that, you really risk building something that's just cool and not useful. I'm super guilty of this at various times in my career of getting really excited about a technical thing I could build and building it and then realizing that it just wasn't actually what anybody needed or wanted because I wasn't connected enough with the people who would ultimately be using it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great summary, I guess, of a lot of questions that people can have. I have a kind of other question, if I may. I guess as we're talking about young architects or architects with a specialty that would want to participate in this endeavor, if you how do you conceptually think about this software being more like an open source thing where people kind of freely share their development of scripts and share it with the public, or do you think there could be a space for having people submit their scripts and monetize it over time?
Yeah, so I mean, all of the above. I think we're very interested in finding ways to incentivize people to share their stuff publicly and for free, but we also are in the process of developing a marketplace for these computational tools so that, if you build the world's best stair configurator and you want to charge other companies to, a fee every time they use it, or I forget exactly how we have it set up, but basically be compensated for the use of a tool that you wrote, we're setting up an infrastructure for that, which I think is really a first in the AEC space. Obviously, we see things like this on, the iOS App Store or whatever. But I think there's a wealth of folks in the community who will just give stuff away because it solved a problem for them and they want to share it with the world. That's certainly been something that's motivated me. I just like sharing stuff that I build that I think is cool and useful. But I also, there are other times when, it takes a lot of work to maintain these things and it's a lot of effort. And so the idea that you could actually get compensated for the knowledge and expertise that you encode and put onto a system like ours, I think is really important as a component of the vision of how we continue to grow and scale this and attract people to take the time to learn Hypar and start building stuff on Hypar.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, so I see we got Mayo came up and has a question. What's up, Mayo? Do you want to jump in or ask a question?
Sure. Hi, Andrew, Ian,
Hey,
Ollie,
Mayo.
and Gulen. I must admit, I'm all hyped about Hypar. So I have two questions. First is, so one trend I have noticed is in the industries, a lot of like companies have their in-house generative design tool. I don't know if it's for productivity or marketing. So when you guys are approaching these companies, and I wanted to know like your thoughts, like why the industry can't collaborate together to build like an open source tool or like common generative design tool instead of reinventing the wheel every time. That's my
I
first.
so Meyer, I'm going to answer this question because we talk a lot about this inside Hypar, and obviously many of the team came out of firms or backgrounds in places where they were building these kinds of tools. I mean, Andrew came out of Woods Bagot, where he once showed me a demo, where they were doing like VR connected to Rhino with like controlling the position of the sun and like all these things that started it like to look like software. Um, but Andrew kind of nailed this earlier on when he was talking about the difference between the tool that you build in your project on your Unity or Unreal Engine or whatever you're using. And by the way, I'll caveat all of this by saying I think all of this stuff is amazing, and I want everybody to start kind of working on these projects. But the difference between that and software is miles and miles of distance, and it's the little things that Andrew was talking about. How do you share this around the world? How do you get the bits on people's computers? How do you make sure that everybody can log in and share information securely and share this thing only with the people they want to and not with the people that they don't want to? How do you make sure that it scales so that if 1,000 people want to use this tool at exactly the same moment and it talks to a web service or something, it doesn't fall down? And so I think the challenge that our industry has right now is that we're in this transition period where these computational designers exist in these firms, and they're wanting to build these tools to not only show off their capabilities, but also to provide value to their customers. And then they hit this scalability point, which is the difference between the tool that you build for a project and software, and the generalization that's required of that. And that's the point at which architecture firms, engineering firms, real estate firms, they don't know how to go any further because they're not software companies. And in many cases, they're not incentivized to go further because like you use this tool on one project and then you put it away, and maybe you'll rebuild it on another project if there's enough fee, or you won't. And again, that's to Andrew's points of earlier. Like that's one of the reasons we built Hypar, is because we just saw people hitting this scalability sort of threshold inside these firms. Now, to your point of why we can't all just collaborate. I've been doing this for so long now, starting with Dynamo a long time ago. The idea that not only is the core application going to be open source, but then the scripts are going to be shared via the package manager. And I'm always heartened to see the millions and millions of scripts that have been shared in that way. But even giving people the ability to do that stuff hasn't fostered this industry-wide sense of open source collaboration. And it's because our industry still holds on to this idea of kind of like the thing that you create as your intellectual property, and it's the thing that gives you a leg up against your competition. There just isn't the sense of sort of collaboration that might exist in other industries, especially around software. And so, to Andrew's earlier point also about Hypar being an open and extensible platform, open source will definitely be one part of it. If you want to publish functions on Hypar as fully open source, that's fantastic. We've even talked about making open source functions free to run on the platform in the future because we want to incentivize. But the other maybe more important point is actually allowing people to turn the things that they put on Hypar into a business, so that they don't have to make a choice between like, oh, if I put this thing on Hypar, I got to share it with everybody and give it away for free and do the same thing that we've all been doing in this industry for the last 10 years is like just getting paid in street cred, for all the hard work that we've done on Dynamo scripts and Grasshopper scripts, and like actually get you paid because the work that you put into that tool has value. And as soon as somebody uses that thing on a platform like Hypar on the other side of the planet who you've never met before, and that whole interaction with your expertise is mediated through software, that's when we achieve, I think, the next level up in our industry.
I see. Like a bit follow-up question is like, I was talking to like a group of people where we were discussing that the construction data, like no one is open sourcing it because of legal issues. And from my experience, I haven't seen like people sharing structural model or BIM model and making it open source. So like, how do you plan to like work around like if there is like legal implication of open sourcing a script or something?
That is, the question. We have a lot of conversations about like, when will machine learning, become a thing in AEC? Like, when will we be able to train machine learning models with Revit data? Um, somebody can raise their hand and tell me that I'm wrong about this, but it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen because Revit models just weren't set up to provide data in that way. They're not normalized in the way that you would need data to be in order to provide all this training data and everything else. So the idea that we're going to ask the construction industry or the architecture industry, whatever, for models, and we're going to glean expertise from those models, I think is probably not what's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is somebody's going to use a system like Hypar. They're going to encode the way that a structure should be built. Brace frame steel structure. They're going to encode that system, and then they're going to use that system to generate thousands or tens of thousands of synthetic data points to actually train the machine learning models of the future. Because a system like Hypar is set up to actually generate data in a fantastic format for doing things like machine learning. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much. I mean, I don't know. Everybody's going to tell me that I'm wrong about this because they think, oh, we've got all these Revit models from the last 20 years. There's so much data in there that we could mine. And I've seen a number of firms like take this problem on, and they've all run into the same thing, is like it's super hard to use this data because it was never built with the intention of being used in that way.
Yeah, I think I agree actually, and also all these models are not necessarily right what's actually built, for example, or they only go so far, or there's many different versions of them from different consultants. Um, yeah, I mean, I don't really see that, but I also agree that the industry. One of the problems is the industry doesn't. We don't collaborate so much between firms. Like if there's like rivalries and stuff like this, or like you know concerns around IP and stuff like that. And even, one of the reasons we started the ArChI-TECH network is to just have discussions between different people in the industry, because there's not a lot, you can tune in and listen to Bjarke, for example, or Rem Koolhaas talk about design for hours, but there's not that many places where you can talk about technology, the technology side of things and the tools that we use. And so that's kind of, part of the why we started the ArChI-TECH network, was to unveil simply the tools that we use, because there's nothing super special, we don't have a special Bjarke button in Grasshopper that we've come up with. We're just using the same tools that a lot of people use, Rhino, Grasshopper, Dynamo, Rhino Inside, all these kind of things. And there's also not so many people teaching it from the perspective of practice. And maybe that brings on to a kind of last few questions of like, what, Andrew, what do you think the skill set should be as a young architect coming up? Because a huge part of what we're getting to with the ArChI-TECH network is courses on, how taking a project from concept into documentation using Rhino, Grasshopper, tools like Enscape have been a great way to kind of streamline the design process, especially from the visualization side. But one of the reasons why I've mentioned Hypar quite a lot in our other talks is I feel like it's the first of a new generation of architecture software where a lot of that is kind of streamlined and all in one place. So what do you feel like it's important to learn as a young architect? Like, is it worth learning all these tools if in a few years they're all going to be kind of, irrelevant? Or, obviously that's probably not going to happen that quickly, but will
Yeah,
be a
I
part
mean,
of a generation
so
of these like ad hoc stitching together Grasshopper, Rhino, and coding, and the next
yeah,
generation is kind of more, you know, accessible, or like kind of plug and play for you in a way.
yeah. So I have a few components of an answer to this. I think one of the most important skills you can foster as a kind of young architect right now that actually has nothing to do with technology is figuring out how to think systemically about design problems. And I would say also becoming an incredibly observant student of the processes of design. Like, talk to more experienced designers in your firm and understand how they make decisions. Understand, like, how do they sit down and figure out a thing? Like, how are they, and you know, you do this on the job, you kind of figure it out as you go along. But I would say, like, just keep in your mind the sort of necessity of translating what are really just a bunch of sort of intuitions and some ad hoc practices that have emerged, and think about how you might describe these to a machine, how you might, like, build a recipe that someone else could follow to produce a similar result. Because ultimately, that's all that programming is turning some process into a recipe that a machine can follow. And so I think, to go hand in hand with that skill set, it's also just important to learn to code, but it's not so important which language you pick. I think I often get young students coming up to me being like, should I learn Python, or should I learn C#, or should I learn Grasshopper? And my answer is yes. Like, doesn't matter. You can use any of those things. You will learn to translate these kind of concepts and ideas and processes into algorithmic code in any of those languages. I think C#, if you had to pick one, I think C# is a pretty good one to start with in AEC, because it's, you know, works really well with Hypar for one, works really well in Rhino, works really well in Revit. There's basically any context where you might want to be coding for your job. C# is likely to be a good tool in your tool belt. Python is a close second. I think you can do a lot of those things with Python as well, and pretty soon you'll be able to author. In fact, you can actually already do this. It just requires a little bit of special knowledge to author a function on Hypar in Python. And so, yeah, I think you know, just pick a technical stack to start learning. We would love it if it were Hypar, but it doesn't really matter. It's really any of these tools. Get familiar with how data works and how algorithms work, but then also spend a fair bit of time, like, just focusing on how you translate real processes into recipes or instructions that a machine can execute.
Yeah, that's great. Would you call that computational thinking, or
Yeah, I think that's a
creative problem
fair
solving?
term for
Yeah,
it. Yeah.
I think that's a great point, and that's one thing Guillaume and I tried to add to our kind of like Grasshopper courses in-house at Big, was just thinking computationally, like, how do you break this problem down into these little bite-sized chunks, is super important. I'd second that as well. I think just pick one and follow the one that interests you the most. I think is super important. But to play devil's advocate, then let's say, and also we're going to have to include a course on Hyper as well. So our other our other stuff doesn't become too too irrelevant in a few years. But let's say Hyper is the next thing that all architects are using, or this kind of new era of being able to share scripts and stuff like that. To play devil's advocate, then, would you be concerned or worried about the idea that the creative process somewhat gets automated in a way, or like, buildings start looking the same because people forget to code themselves, and then they're just using whatever scripts are available and that kind of thing? Like, do you think we'll be losing a bit of creative touch as architects, or not?
I can pretty confidently say no. I'm not worried about that. I think that, for one, there is already a degree to which, like, the buildings that are built in the world have a lot of commonality and have a lot of, are using similar processes. And to that extent, like, Hypar can be a vehicle for doing that more efficiently and more easily. But, in addition to, I don't want to make it sound like Hypar is just executing scripts.
Right,
I think one of the things that we've been focusing on really intently is making it so that it's an environment where you can design and model and just apply scripts as needed, sort of bring in the logic of a system so that you don't have to think about all the specifics, at least, not at an early stage of design. So I think that, there are sort of different kinds of decisions you can make in a design process that operate at different levels of abstraction. There's like the sort of individual object level decision, like where does this thing go? And then there are also sort of system level decisions, like what is the overarching concept here, or what is the structural system that I'm using? And there's creativity in all of these layers of decision making. And I think, working computationally is an asset to that. It allows you to sort of focus on the specific individual decisions that matter and allow you to kind of forget about the ones that don't. In a way, and this is a little bit of a strange thing to say, it's kind of like sketching in that when you sketch, you can leave out a lot of detail. You can just focus on the pieces that are sort of relevant to what the problem you're focusing on at the moment, and then your imagination sort of fills in the rest. You're not drawing, every screw, and you're not drawing, every brick in the wall. You can just kind of sketch and the rest fills in. And I think what automation can provide is actually like producing a little bit more fidelity to sort of fill in the gaps there. And, and of course, there's a risk that you get driven in a direction that maybe you didn't want or that wasn't what you had in mind, but that's the point where you go in and you intervene and you change what's happening there. I don't think any of that ever forces you into a particular design solution. And we're always, regardless of what tools you're using, whether they're digital or analog or whatever, you're always in a creative tension and partnership with the tools that you're using. If you're going to model something in Rhino, you're going to do NURBSy buildings. If you're going to model something in SketchUp, it's going to have particular characteristics. If you're going to design the whole thing in Revit, it's probably going to be particularly normative and have whatever, doors were already in there by default. So there's, it is important to be thoughtful about the defaults that we provide, but I think it's even more important to always enable a sort of manipulation or overriding of any of those defaults that the software chooses on your behalf.
I'm going to just tag on to the end of that. What we often do when we talk to people about Hypar is we say, think of the last building that you worked on. Now take the skin off that building, take out all the ceilings and the drywall, and what's inside. Imagine if you could just sketch and all of that stuff just appeared. The structural system, the mechanical system, all the hardware that hangs the mechanical system, all the fire stopping that stops up all the holes around where the mechanical system goes through the walls. Imagine all the other systems in a building that we can automate, that people are fine to give away the idea of we're going to automate this. They're like, hell yeah, let's automate all of that stuff. I don't want to lay out a commercial bathroom. I want quick decisions. Even the product that we have out there right now, Hypar Space, which starts to kind of bump up against design considerations because obviously you're laying out real furniture and real spaces, is really more about just making very quick, cheap decisions. If you can snap your fingers and have 10 different options for a floor plate for an office fit out, why wouldn't you want to do that as a designer? Is the act of moving CAD blocks around on a page and snapping them together, is that your value as a designer? We believe that your value lies in another place. So I think there's so much stuff that we can automate on Hypar before we even get to brushing up against the kind of design thinking.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's a lot of people ask me this question. I feel it's the same thing. It's more about automating the things we don't need to do, so we can spend more time on the things that we really add value as architects. So yeah, I think I'm on your side. It looks like we've got 2 more questions. Andrew, if you guys have time,
Yeah.
then let's take a couple more. We got Richard. How's it going? Good to see you again. Do you have a question or something you want to add?
Hi, I'm really happy to be back. So, hi Andrew, hi Ian. My question lies that if we say that Unity is strength and that's what Hypar is up to, So here there are two stakeholders. When we are making a function in Hyper, I'm been playing on Hyperspace a lot nowadays. So my question arises, like, when there are two stakeholders, one is the client who holds the NDAs, like non-disclosure agreements, and if we do put some of a material which is very confidential on Hyper, as Hyper is itself an API, how it is taken care of. And the other second stakeholder comes when like the person who is designing that function, how the algorithmic thinking that is unique to that person or the architect is surveillanced or saved within the API, or the safety of it.
So I think there are a few questions there, but I think most of this is sort of revolving around, the sort of the security of private or confidential data that gets put on Hypar. And, I think we use industry standard sort of technological security processes to make sure that all of that stuff is protected. But I think most importantly, everything on Hypar, everything you put on Hypar is totally private to you by default. We don't go making anything that you add to Hypar available to anybody else unless you explicitly give permission to do so. So if you want to share the workflow that you've built with a stakeholder, a customer, or a client, you can do that, but they won't be able to access it until you explicitly make that available to them, until you share it with them. And, I think over time we'll probably evolve more sort of granular controls over like how much permission you let people have when you share something with them. But for now, you can let somebody view something. You can let somebody, even edit it potentially. And we're working on a lot of interesting collaboration tools around that. And we are an open ecosystem where anybody can kind of contribute code, but we also, we can put other protections in place to make sure that the code that other people, like, you wouldn't want somebody to submit a function to Hypar that was going to harvest your model data without your consent or whatever. So we also, because we control all of these systems, we can put more protections in place to say, it has to be reviewed before we make it available to, to paying customers or whatever. We're still sorting out some of the details of that, but we know how incredibly important it is to our users to have fine-grained control over what they're comfortable sharing. And if they're going to entrust us with that data, we're going to do everything in our power to shepherd that responsibly.
I'll just add to that, and thank you very much for the question, Richard. The security of our users' private data is incredibly important to us. As a cloud service, we need to conform to regulations, for instance, like the general data privacy regulations in Europe, and increasingly like the same sort of regulation in California and other states in the United States. So the security of people's information, and especially any information that could be construed as like publicly or personally identifiable information, is incredibly important to us. And I like to point out, whenever we get a question like this, that it's actually more important to us in many ways than it is to your architecture engineering firm working in the way that you typically do with, like, you've got a local network in your office, and you've got people who walk around to computers with thumb drives and just like download all the data and everything else. For people who are working in web services and building web applications for people to share, access, and in our case, generate data, this is an incredibly sensitive and important topic for us. And to just drive another nail into what Andrew was saying, it's always top of mind for us. Now, the good news is we don't actually store a lot of your data in our system. If you import a CAD plan as a background for a Hypar space layout, we hold on to that. And obviously, again, it's all private to you. But in terms of the amount of data that we generate, we only really hold on to the generated assets for the last set of executions that you did on the platform. There's a very sort of thin layer of data that we actually hold at any time. So I hope that gives a little bit more clarity.
Yeah.
Thanks for the question. You're safe with Hypar. So I think we'll have one more question from Nignaz. Good to see you as always, Nignaz.
Yes, hello, thank you. Thank you so much. Sorry if there's windy here. It's very windy here today in San Francisco. So, my question is actually about your clients and how you find them if you're usually more interested in bigger firms. Because I'm an architect and I've been practicing architecture. I've been always the person in the firm being interested in new technologies and introducing the new technologies to the principals and decision makers in the office. And I found it very challenging, especially like medium-sized firms, to convince decision makers and principals about the power and the potentials of these really cool technologies out there. So I've recently started aecplustech.com, which is a website, a platform that I wanted to make it easy to, engage and keep up with all these, cool AEC technologies out there. But generally, there is a big gap between the tech world and the people who are practicing in the industry, especially, those who are at the decision making level. And there are 800, I did a research on like the number, there are 800,000 AEC firms in the US and only in the US, and only maybe 1 or 2% are the bigger ones, very resourceful. They have like a design technology person, design technology committee who is like designated to do the research. But the rest are really like left out and they don't even know like many of the terms that we use and what's happening out there. So my question for you if you are interested to go after smaller firms and medium-sized firms, and if you or if your clients are mostly like the bigger companies.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's something we do a lot of thinking about. And listening to today's conversation, you might come away with the impression that Hypar is a tool for, sort of computational experts to put their logic. But first and foremost, it is a design tool. And you don't have to write any code or contribute any custom functions or have any particular computational knowledge to take advantage of Hypar for your projects in order to make things more efficient or do a layout or do a design study. You don't need to add any new functionality to Hypar in order to do that. And so we've actually had some success where we have worked with firms that maybe never even made it as far as Revit. They are in kind of CAD-based workflows, but they want to do something smarter, and they don't necessarily want to upskill everybody on BIM. And so we sort of see an opportunity for firms like that to leapfrog over and sort of skip the step where they have to become BIM experts or develop an internal computational modeling team and just go straight to an easy to use design environment like Hypar, where you can just bring in automation tools that other people have already created. So I think there's a big opportunity there, and we would love to penetrate, I think, even further into kind of smaller and medium-sized firms who stand a lot to gain by adopting technologies that will let them automate the sort of tedious parts of the process. I will say I think most of our customers so far have been on the larger side and have already had like some computational capability. But I think as we grow and as the sort of set of functions available on Hypar expands, we'll be able to reach more and more of those folks, maybe even those that have never even thought of themselves as sort of technologically advanced. Do you want to add anything to that, Ian?
Yeah, I think that mostly covers it, but I think the interesting trajectory that Andrew plotted out there, as there's more capability on the platform, and that capability comes in the form of people's expertise, which has been shared with the community. The number of things that you can do on day one will increase, and that will necessarily make it easier for smaller firms to, as we say, punch above their weight. That's the story of technology. The story of technology is you should be able to do more, much more, significantly more with less people. And right now we compete on even the way that we're having this conversation, big firms, little firms. I've got 200 people in my firms. I've got 20 people in my firm. And that dictates how much work you can do. technology should be something that we're applying in AEC so that that no longer dictates how much work you should do. If you're a company that did 5 projects last year, you should be able to have access to a platform that gives you expertise and these quick decision-making tools that allows you to do 15 projects the next year. So that's something we're definitely looking at. We don't want to be, just another add-on in the toolbox of the computational design teams in the 5 biggest firms in the United States. That would be a failure mode for Hypar.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think that also taps on with a lot of what I've been saying previously. Is I see a lot more. We'll see a future where architecture firms will be much smaller, but you're able to do a lot more with a lot less. Like you'll have a firm of super users rather than, a firm of, 10 super users versus 50, typical architects, let's say. So yeah, I think that's really interesting, and Hyper is absolutely going to be a part of that future. I know we've had you guys for almost over an hour now, so I think this is maybe a good point to wrap it up. But I think it's been super interesting to have you guys because we've been mentioning Hyper a lot in our talks. Just, people are like, what's the next thing? I was like, you guys should check out Hyper, and everyone in the audience, go down to hyper.io, check out them on Instagram as well, and you can download it and give it a go. And
You don't even need to download it. You can just
there you
log
go.
in.
My mind is not switched. You don't need to download it. Yeah, of course. See, I haven't switched. I'm still in the
Desktop mindset.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I do feel the last point I will touch on is that term of leapfrogging. I think that's what I was getting at with the skill set thing, is maybe the next generation of young architects will leapfrog a lot of this, BIM computation terms, because they'll be working on, platform like Hyper, which kind of makes all this stuff a lot more accessible. So yeah, I think everyone be sure to check it out. We'll definitely have to do, so we might go on a little break from our talks, so we might not be here next week, or definitely the week after. Part for 2 reasons. One is I'm relocating to London, so I'm getting a little bit busy. And 2, we are just about to launch our YouTube channel soon. And so we got a couple kind of tutorials, and some of these talks go on our YouTube page. And for sure, we will have to do a video on Hyper, when we'll make a project in Hyper real quick and put it on YouTube. And yeah, we're definitely going to have to add this to my skill set as well, and dig into Hyper a little bit more. But thank you, Andrew, for joining us, and Ian for your impromptu joining. But I couldn't, it's awesome to have you, and we should have you on alone to talk about Dynamo and of course getting to Hyper. But yeah, it's been super great. I really appreciate you guys giving us the time and to talk to us today.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Awesome.
Thank you.
All right, guys. Thanks everyone for joining. Tune in on our Instagram page. I'll let you guys know what's happening next week. We're probably going to be on a little bit of a break, but yeah, we'll be back soon enough with some more interesting talks and hopefully some new YouTube stuff. So, thanks everyone for joining. Have a good Sunday, and we'll speak in a few weeks.
Thanks, Andrew and Ian.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Thank you. Gonna miss ARCHI-TECH.
Thank you.